So welcome everybody to our first Curious Conversation speaker series of the year. Thank you all for coming out. I'll tell you a little bit more about the upcoming ones we have coming afterwards, but let's get started. I want to introduce Jerianne Albers, who is the Furbearer and Turkey Program Leader for the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. She received her bachelor's in natural resources from the University of Illinois. We won't hold that against her as Purdue fans. And her master's in wildlife resources from West Virginia University. She's worked in 9 states, including Wisconsin and North Carolina, and she joined the Indiana DNR in 2017. So give her a warm welcome.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Jerianne. I'm with the Indiana DNR. I'm specifically with the Division of Fish and Wildlife. There's a bunch of different units within DNR. There's state parks and forestry and historic preservation and mining and reclamation. So I'm in the Division of Fish and Wildlife within that. And I work with furbearers and turkeys, and we're going to talk about furbearers today. And I will explain what that is eventually. But we're going to kind of focus in on a couple species. I'm going to introduce you to a bunch of different species. But we're going to kind of focus in and spend a little more time on the ones that are kind of more common in our urban central Indiana landscape. And then we'll spend a little less time on some of our less common ones, but ones that are still around. But first, I always like to start with a little bit of context about who I am, what we do as a division. So the mission statement of the Division of Fish and Wildlife is to balance the benefits of fish, wildlife, and their habitats. That means thinking about the ecological, the biological, the economic, the recreational, thinking about all of that and trying to figure out how can we balance the needs and the wants of people and the landscape. And within that, for my program, what I typically tell people I do breaks down into 3 major pillars. The first one is sustaining furbearers for future generations. We want our grandkids to have healthy and robust wildlife populations, and I think about that specifically through the lens of furbearers and turkeys. There's what everybody thinks I do, that's filling information gaps, right? That's collecting data, doing surveys, coordinating research projects, trying to figure out what don't we know that we need to know in order to find the balance of those benefits of wildlife. And then there's incorporating public values into management decisions. So sometimes it's doing more surveys, right? Figuring out what the public values, what the public perceptions are of different topics. And then how do we incorporate those public needs, desires, and perceptions into the decisions that we're making? So how many of you have heard of the public trust model? Okay, just a few. So in North American early history, right, indigenous people were here. They were very connected to the landscape and to wildlife, connected culturally, spiritually, for subsistence. And they had their own ways of managing wildlife and practices around wildlife. And then colonizers started coming over primarily from Europe. And in Europe, the main wildlife management system was the king owns the animals, don't look at them, right? So it was kind of, if you were an average person, or even worse, like a serf back in the Middle Ages, you were not allowed to have anything to do with wildlife, unless you were doing it illegally, right? Because the king, the crown, royalty owned the animals. When they started coming over, they came to the abundance that was North America, and they're like, whoa, this will never run out of anything. There's animals and resources everywhere. Right? And so a lot of our early history after Europeans came over there wasn't a lot of regulations, there wasn't management, anything like that. That did result in us losing some of our wildlife here in Indiana and in other states, like the white-tailed deer, the turkey, things like that, which we eventually, around early 1900s, were like, hey, this isn't going great. We maybe should do something a little differently. But when we were thinking through what management would look like, we're like, well, we don't want the king owns everything again. What are we going to do different? And this public trust model emerged of how we manage wildlife. So that means there's 3 key groups when it comes to thinking about wildlife management at a state level, because states manage wildlife in the public trust. So there's the beneficiaries. That's people like you, right? That's the average citizen, the residents of Indiana, the people who live here and care. And they have a few obligations. They're supposed to be engaged and informed stakeholders, right? And they also need to make sure that you don't foreclose options for future generations. So if the entire state of Indiana was like, we hate golden-winged warblers, let them go extinct. We hate them. That would be foreclosing options for future generations who might really value that animal, right? So we need to not foreclose on those options, make sure we're doing things where these animals will still be around in future decades. And then there's the trust administrators over here. They are the elected officials that make the majority of the decisions around things like regulations. So that's our legislature, and that's for the DNR, the Natural Resources Commission. So they are the main decision makers, and they have responsibility and accountability from the beneficiaries, right? Because if beneficiaries don't like what they're doing to actually administer that trust, they could elect someone else, right? And then the trust managers down here are people like me. You know, people who are hired because we have degrees, we collect the data, we fill information gaps, and we make recommendations and provide information to the trustees so they can make informed decision making. But we are not actually making the day-to-day decisions around regulations and things like that, right? So as my colleague says, we make recommendations, not regulations. And we are held accountable by the trustees. If we're not doing our job well, they can fire us, hire someone else, right? And we have to consider the interests of all the beneficiaries, which is what we do through things like public meetings or surveys and things like that. So this is the scheme that we operate under now across the United States for wildlife management. We have this public trust model that has checks and balances and accountability across these different levels, and my job is down here as the trust manager. So what we're going to talk about today are my furbearers. I'm not going to highlight my turkeys, but we're going to focus in on the furbearers. So the furbearer is an animal whose fur has value for being made into wearable items, right? Historically, these are the species that were trapped for their fur. They're the ones who get made into coats. They're warm. They have double layers of fur, so it helps keep off the cold. That's really critical. Some places where it gets really cold, like Canada and Russia, because fur doesn't freeze up in the same way that some of the synthetics and things like that do. Now, not all of our furbearers have seasons on them in Indiana today, but that's why they're lumped together. I have 2 rodents, some carnivores, a marsupial, like animals you wouldn't necessarily think to put together, but they're kind of bonded because of this history of them being important for being made into clothing and things like that. And these are the 14 species we have here in Indiana. And like I said, I'm going to start with some of the ones that are the most common, you're most likely to interact with, and then we're going to work our way down and just touch on a few that you're maybe not likely to go your whole life and never get to see, but are cool when we have them. So we're starting out with this cute face. Does everybody know what this is? This is our raccoon, right? How many of you have seen a raccoon? Oh, yeah. Yeah, right? So they're pretty common, right? They're an interesting mammal. They're very good at living around people, right? They're omnivores, so they will eat anything that they can put in their mouth and chew, basically. They love fruit. They'll get into garbage. They love mice and rodents and things like that. They typically will have 1 litter in spring, but they can have a second litter in late summer, so you could see baby raccoons through quite a bit of the year. And they are doing pretty well in Indiana. They're a very common animal. They're one of our more common furbearers. And this is data from our Archer's Index survey. So this is where deer hunters in fall, when they're sitting in their archery stand, hoping a deer walks by, tell us how many hours they've been hunting, where they are, county, and then what wildlife they see while they're sitting there quietly for a number of hours, hoping a deer walks by. And so most of my furbearers are on the survey, and this top one is the bar for the statewide, right? And you can see pretty stable. We have some peaks and valleys. Wildlife populations naturally fluctuate. But overall, our raccoon populations are pretty stable, and they're doing well. This is the graph for North Central, which is what the region we're in right now. You can see there's a little more bouncing around, but now I'm going to give you a quick crash course in statistics. No, I'm not. I'm kidding. But does anybody know what these are?
Margins of error.
Those are our margins of error. We could sometimes call them standard deviations. The only reason I bring this up is because they're important when you're reading a graph, right? You can see these are pretty small, right? And basically, when you're looking at a graph, if these overlap with points next to each other, then that may not be a real difference, right? So if you're, this basically is we are 95% sure this is the number. No, sorry, we're 90% sure this is the number, and we're 95% sure it's somewhere between here. And you can see, well, that's pretty big, right? Whereas opposed to, you know, some of these little guys where it's much smaller. So this can be important because this can look like a huge drop between these two. But they do overlap a little bit, so that might not be as extreme as it looks, right? And this is really helpful for if you're looking at a graph, just to have a little bit of context. Like, is this something I need to be worried about? Because, like, this seems gigantic. But really, those are overlapping. We're not, like, super sure exactly where that number is, so it's probably not as extreme as it looks, right? And I only say that because this raccoon graph does on North Central jumps around a lot. And the other thing to think about when I'm showing you data like this is who is providing us this data? Hunters. Are hunters hunting in downtown Indianapolis? Not really, right? So this is really a more rural context typically, and not necessarily like Noblesville raccoons are doing this, okay? But it's one of the long-term trend surveys that we use to understand how raccoon populations might be changing over time, and to just check in on any red flags where it's like, do we need to be worried about this animal because of what's going on? But generally, we're not worried about raccoons. But you can see there's a lot more variability here. And it looks like it may have come down a little bit. That might be related to something I'm going to talk about in a minute, some disease things. Actually, that is next. Great. So raccoons have a lot of diseases. Surprise. But most commonly, what you will see if you see a sick raccoon in your yard is distemper, right? Distemper does not affect people, so it's not a human health concern. As long as your pets are vaccinated, it's not a concern for your pets either. You always want to keep them up to date on vaccinations. But we get regular reports of sick raccoons, and it's typically distemper. These are all the sick raccoon reports we had in 2024, and you can see there's quite a few here, right? Urban areas are really great for raccoons. They love them because there's a lot of food, right? And that also can mean sometimes they congregate around the lot of food, right? There's a great apple tree or persimmon tree, all the raccoons are going to come in to try to get the fruit. And if you think about our urban landscape, like there's just a ton of food for them between backyard chickens, which they will sometimes, either steal the eggs or try to eat the chickens, backyard gardens, trash, fruit trees, like all of these things, raccoons love it, right? So we do occasionally see these outbreaks, especially in our urban areas, and that's a natural thing for raccoon populations. If they're getting kind of high, sometimes a disease outbreak will knock them down a little bit, and that's totally normal. But it can be concerning when you're like, there's a raccoon just spinning around in a circle in my yard. Is like, do I need to be worried about this? Most likely it's distemper, and again, not a human health risk, not a risk for your pets as long as you're keeping up to date on vaccinations. And if you do find a dead raccoon, typically you can wear gloves and then double bag it and put it in the trash can if you find one. But you can also report any sick wildlife, like sick raccoons, to this website right here. And that helps us make nice maps like this and kind of figure out where did we maybe have an outbreak last year. Raccoons can occasionally get other diseases, but the number one we find when we test some of these, we don't test all of them, but the ones we test, distemper's the biggest by far. And that's one of the major calls I get about raccoons of like, this raccoon's staggering around my yard, what do I do about it? So, and then raccoons can also be fun because again, they love living near people. People provide them so much food, right? So as people, we can take steps to help make sure we're living successfully around raccoons, right? We can kind of cohabitate nicely, right? And the big thing with raccoons is to avoid feeding them, right? Maybe sounds obvious, but if you start putting out a bunch of food and bringing a bunch of raccoons in, more likely to get disease outbreaks, more likely to transmit diseases to possibly even your pets and things like that, right? So a lot of people, they see those cute eyes and they're like, he looks hungry. He's not, trust me. Like, raccoons are very good at finding their own food. So you don't need to put out cat food for them. If they start getting into your bird feeders, try to figure out a way to keep them out of your bird feeders and things like that. And they also, you want to think about ways they might get into your house, because the other thing is they start coming up to your home. The other common call we get is there's a raccoon in my attic, or there's a raccoon in my garage, what can I do about it? And prevention is really the best remedy when it comes to things like that. Try to keep your tree branches trimmed so the raccoon can't even get onto your roof. And then if like a corner of your soffit falls off, you'll be like, I'll get it later. Maybe go ahead and replace that soffit. So that raccoon can't get up in there where you don't want them to be, right? So raccoons can do a great job living in urban areas and finding their own food, but you just want to make some smart choices around your house. And I did actually bring this fact sheet with me if anybody wants to grab one with some tips and things on it related to raccoons over there at the end. So they're a pretty cool animal, one that's super common. Most of you will probably see a raccoon in your life if you have not already. And they're probably one of the most common Furbearers people interact with. Hopefully not trying to pet them or feed them interact with, but at least see and know are in their area. And then we have this fella. Nope. Coyote. Yeah. This is our coyote. This is probably our second most common fur bearer and one people see a lot. This one elicits strong reactions in people, this reaction usually, right? So people see a coyote and they think wolf. Wolves, bad. Because we have a long storytelling tradition throughout the ages of wolves being a perilous animal to be around, right? You think about werewolf myths. You think about Little Red Riding Hood and grandma getting eaten, right? You think about Gmork, the wolf sidekick of the nothing in the Neverending Story, right? Wolves are often portrayed negatively. Even if you saw the recent animated movie, The Bad Guys, the leader was a wolf, right? And people will look at our coyote and be like, no, that scares me. I don't like it, right? Which is a shame, because coyotes are great. But our brain has just had all this training of like, wolf, not good. And they see that, and they react the same way. But our coyotes are not wolves, and even wolves themselves are not what movies make them out to be and things like that. But they're much smaller than people expect them to be, but they're tall, right? So people are like, it was bigger than my German Shepherd. And I'm like, I hate to break it to you, but your German Shepherd's fat. Like, your German Shepherd sleeps on the couch 14 hours a day, and you feed him twice a day. Like, he is not living a hard life, right? Coyotes gotta find their own food. So they're tall like a German Shepherd, but they're very thin. They gotta be able to move quietly through underbrush in order to look for mice and rabbits and squirrels, which are their big three things that they eat. And so they're very thin. A lot of times people are like, I saw a giant coyote. I'm like, I bet that coyote was 25 pounds. Because they're just very thin. They have very narrow chests, whereas most domestic dog breeds have been bred to be really big, barrel-chested animals. But coyotes are very thin and thin-chested, so they'll be tall. In winter, they get very fluffy, because you've got to have a thick coat to be living out here. You know, February right now, we just had a couple inches of snow. It is very cold outside. I think it's supposed to be single digits tonight. Like, if you're living outside in that, you got to have thick fur. So people always project these like huge animals that are scary onto coyotes, but they're really not. They just want to eat the mice around your home and help you out. And they're really common in urban areas. We commonly get like, I saw a coyote, you need to go move it into nature. And I'm like, well, I hate to break it to you, but your neighborhood is nature. Like, your neighborhood is habitat, and it's pretty good habitat. But coyotes are really good at living in these urban areas, but trying to keep some distance from people. Right? When they're in urban areas, they tend to use spaces like this, cemeteries. You know, they use golf courses, parks, green spaces. You know, you go somewhere like here, and what do you see a lot of in cemeteries? Rabbits, squirrels, right? So there's a lot of food, the neighbors are quiet, right? And they can have a little distance from people. This is some work from the Urban Chicago Coyote Study. They've been doing this study for a long time, I think over 2 decades now. And they've learned some really interesting things about urban coyotes in the process. And you know, Chicago being our near neighbor, we can learn a lot of lessons from what they have found out about their coyotes. But all these little dots on the map are coyotes. The different colors are different coyotes. So you can see there's this blue one here, and it's really focused in on this park. You can see there's a neighborhood here in its home range, but it never goes into it. And even this green one, there's a little bit of neighborhood on the edges. It never goes into there, really. The purple one here, off to the left, your left. I was like, my left or your left? It's still mostly focusing on green spaces, right? There's kind of a little like park here. This is like a utility line. There's like a utility tower, like a cell tower here. And you see every once in a while, this one will foray out into a neighborhood, probably looking for food, because again, yards can be really good sources of food if you're looking for things like mice and fruit, which is mostly what coyotes are looking for. But for the most part, they stick really strong to green spaces, right? And their diet is still pretty similar, even in urban areas. People are like, well, their diet's probably like all cats and rats. It's really not in urban areas. They're still eating voles and rabbits and squirrels. There are coyotes that actually live in downtown Chicago, like go out on Navy Pier at night when people aren't there. But they're not eating rats. They're still eating, you know, sometimes garbage, things like that, but they're eating voles. They actually thought it was really interesting because coyotes seem to avoid rats in cities, and it's likely because of the diseases that they might carry. So they're pretty strategic about the food they're foraging for. Now, they will, another common concern we get is like pets, right? Well, the big one is like, are they gonna eat my children? Again, no, this is not Little Red Riding Hood. They're not going to eat your children. For coyotes living really close up to humans in these urban areas, we have very few problems with them. The main problem we have is them eating backyard chickens and things like that. They will occasionally go after a pet. Usually it's either a cat who's roaming free, which it's better if cats are inside for various reasons, but to protect them is a big one, or a dog, but if the dogs are usually because they're territorial. Coyotes set and defend a set territory, and they don't want other canines in it. They protect their pups, which they'll be having here in about a month in March. They'll have their pups for the year, and they don't want other dogs to come in and threaten them. So a lot of times they'll see dogs as a risk that they need to keep an eye on, rather than a source of food. But that's a common question we get. It's pretty easy to protect your pets, right? Make sure you're outside with your dog, keep it on a leash if it's gonna be outside. A kennel with the secure top is recommended. Same thing with cats. Try to either be with them or put them in something secure, especially with cats, because there can also be concerns around like owls and things like that, swooping down for them. So them being in something that's secure can be really helpful. And again, just not having food out that's gonna attract the coyotes in. There was a woman in Chicago who had a kind of low bird feeder, but she'd put out like peanut butter bread on it for some of the birds, and then a coyote figured it out, and that coyote's like, I live here now. But she took that away and stopped putting out food for a couple weeks, and the coyote's like, I guess I don't live here now, and the coyote moved on, right? So they'll come into food, especially easy food. So if you can just reduce things like that, it's pretty easy to live successfully with coyotes, and they're not wolves. You don't have to be scared of them. They're really cool. Just appreciate them eating mice for you. Another common face. I'm sure most of you have run into a possum at some point. This is the Virginia opossum. It is the only marsupial we have in North America, but there are a variety of possums and opossums in South America and Australia. But this is ours. This is the one we have. Marsupial just means they have a pouch they raise their young in. They're pretty neat because they are our only marsupial. They give birth after just a few days, and the whole litter will be like way less than a penny, and they will climb in, and they can't have more than 13 babies because that's how many nipples they have. It's very specific. They can have less than that, but they can't have more. And then they raise them in the pouch until they're old enough to be out on their own. They're, again, omnivores. They love being around people for the same reason, the fruit, right, the mice, the garbage, your compost bin, and then things like worms and roaches and different invertebrates and things like that are kind of their main sources of food. Again, it's an animal that's doing well, right? Our population is pretty stable. This is going back to that Archer's Index data. You can see they have a little more peaks and valleys statewide than the raccoons do, but long term, doing well. And same thing with our central Indiana data. Again, a lot more. You can see some of these confidence intervals are pretty big, but overall, we've got a nice stable trend line. Possums are doing well. Now, there's this myth around possums that they eat ticks. And I hate to break it to anyone who thinks this is true, but it is not. They're really cool and helpful in a lot of other ways. They do like to clean up carrion, so if something dies in your yard, they'll take care of it for you. They're like helpful little garbage bin, but in a little fursuit. But they are not going around foraging for ticks. They're very diligent groomers of their fur, so if a tick gets on them, they will eat it. Unlike me, where when I find a tick, I cut it in half, set it on fire, and then flush it down the drain. Possums just eat them when they find them, but they're not actively foraging for ticks. They do eat a lot of other invertebrates and things like that, and like I said, they're great cleaners up of things that die. They help keep our environment clean that way, and they're very not aggressive animals. They're not gonna run up and attack you, right? They move really slowly. Like, it's actually really easy to catch a possum, but you absolutely should not. Please don't go around trying to catch possums, but you definitely could if you wanted to. And their main defense mechanisms are making themselves as gross as possible. They will excrete things from every orifice they can if they're scared, to try to be like, I am too gross, you should not eat me. Or the famous playing possum, where they play dead. And it's actually like, we don't fully understand the physiology behind it, but they do seem to go into like a comatose state when they play possum. It's not like they're really good actors, like their body physically responds, their heart rate slows, and they kind of go into like a weird coma state when they're playing possum, when they go into that defense mechanism. But those are the two main defenses, because they're not running away for much of anything. They're not speed creatures. Their other main defense is just trying to climb up a tree and get away if it's like a dog or something like that. And it is not uncommon for dogs to bring these back if they find one. And again, usually just give it a few hours of quiet and see if he's not actually dead. He might look real dead, but he might not be dead. So just give them some time to come back. And they're great animals to have around because, again, you don't have to worry about them having negative interactions, really, and they can do you a lot of ecosystem services in your yard. So this fella, this is the fox. This is our red fox. This is probably the fox you're more likely to run into. We do have another one. We're going to talk about it a little later. But this is our more common fox, especially in this part of the state and in our urban areas. These guys, similar to coyotes, they kind of breed in January. They're going to have their pups here in about a month. Omnivores as well. We got a lot of my animals will eat a lot of different things. Right? They love fruit, they love chipmunks, they love groundhogs. So if you're having a groundhog or a chipmunk problem, these guys can help you out. One of the biggest calls we get about red foxes is about dens, because unlike coyotes, red foxes love to be up in people's yards. They probably have some measure of safety there because coyotes are avoiding those areas, so they can kind of partition themselves from coyote heavy use areas. But they will be like, you got a barn, I'm gonna live under it. You got a deck, might live under that too, right? But the good thing about red foxes is that they don't use dens for very long. They're not sleeping in dens year-round or anything like that. Basically, they use them when the fox's pups are the most helpless, and then they leave. So a lot of times, if someone's like, I have a den, they're like, can we move it somewhere else? That's kind of hard to do because the chances of getting all of the pups is pretty tough. Right? Even this den, we had a camera on this den for about 4 weeks until they moved on. And I thought there was 5 pups, and then in one photo out of like 3,000 photos, there was 6 pups. And I'm like, where did this other one come from? Where have you been hiding? Because you can't really tell them apart. They're all just like cute little red foxes, right? So you never really know how many pups. Typically, 4 to 6 or 7 is normal for red foxes. They can have a few less. It depends on the age of the mom and things like that. But usually we counsel people like, look, if you can just give it a couple weeks, they will probably move on, and then you can block off the den so they don't come back next year. We typically don't have a lot of problems with them interacting with pets or anything like that. Like I said, if you have a chipmunk problem, they might actually help you out. But usually if you can just have some patience, they'll switch dens at least once, if not twice, and they really only use dens from March to July. Right, so it's usually not too long, 4 to 6 weeks, you get to enjoy cute pups running around, hopefully, and then they're gonna clear out anyway. The other big call we get about red foxes is mange. Mange is totally common in foxes, it's really normal. Probably 1 in every 10 or so foxes has mange or will have it in their life, but it looks bad, right? When you look at that, you're like, ew, like, should we do something about this? But typically, we tell people to let the foxes continue to live their lives. Like, they are better off if they are in the wild, right? And like I said, this is a totally normal process in fox populations. Some of them can recover from it. A few might die, but that is a normal part of life cycles as well. And usually, there's not much you can do as far as interventions. We do tell people that if the fox is like really, really bad, like has no hair and its skin is oozing, you can see if there's a local wildlife rehabilitator who will take it and treat it. Not all of them take adult animals and things like that, but you can at least check. But a fox like this, it's mousing right now. That's why this dramatic photo was of it hopping. Like, it'll be fine to find its own food, and there's a chance that it'll recover just fine. So we typically recommend with mange, just let it keep being a fox. Even though it looks bad, it's totally normal for foxes to occasionally have mange, either a little or even sometimes a lot. And sometimes it'll clear up on its own. And it's not usually a risk. Mange is a little mite that kind of gets into the follicle of the hair, and it's the itching that eventually gets the hair out. It's not the mite itself. But because some people are worried about their dogs. It's like, my dog's in the same yard as the fox, is it gonna get mange? No. Mange does not live long off of warm bodies, so your fox and your dog would have to be sharing a bed. So don't do that, and it'll be fine. They have to have prolonged close contact, basically. So the fox and the dog would have to be spending a lot of shared time touching each other or very close to each other for mange mites to move over. So it's not typically a risk for your pets or human health. We just get a lot of calls about it because people are always sad because foxes are so pretty, right? And they're like, but it looks sad. And it's like, but it's happier being a wild animal rather than being pulled into captivity. Then we have these fellas, these little cuties. Does anybody know what these guys are? They're muskrats. Good job. These are muskrats. Yeah, they're right there in the little crook of the tree. There's 2 of them. So muskrats are an animal a lot of people don't spend any time thinking about in their life. But they are probably near you and you do not realize it. It's likely if water is around, there might be some muskrats nearby. They do like retention ponds and things like that. So a lot of times neighborhoods will have retention ponds with a few cattails in them, and muskrats will move in. People will often be like, there's a tiny beaver in our pond. There's a couple of them. And I'm like, those are muskrats. So a lot of people don't realize they're around or don't recognize them when they see them, but they're pretty common in our water resources throughout our urban areas and the central part of the state. They're pretty neat, and they provide a lot of great habitat, actually. We've done some research that actually shows marsh birds are more likely to show up at places where muskrats are because they create little openings that some of the marsh birds really value. And they create little openings for ducks to rest in too when there's cattails and things like that. So they provide great habitat. The one problem muskrats often cause, though, that people come to us about are digging into the banks of retention ponds, or if they have a water control structure, like a dike or something like that, muskrats burrowing into them is often a common complaint we get. Most of the things that you can do to resolve that, it's best if you do it when you're building the structure. Some of them are a little harder to do after the fact, but you can. One of the big things is muskrats like to dig into slopes. So they want it to be fairly steep so they can push in and kind of have a little upraised end. If you have a very gradual slope coming out from a body of water, they're less likely to dig into it because they can't get the angle that they really want, right? And then some other things are like riprap, those big rocks and stuff. Sometimes will deter muskrats from digging in. And then the other thing that you can sometimes do if they're causing bad damage is put down the that kind of orange drift fence that they use at construction sites or for snow. You know, it's got holes in it, but they're kind of a plasticky. If you actually lay that flat, put a little light layer of dirt over and let plants grow up through it, you can have a vegetated bank, but the muskrats won't be able to burrow through that material to then form dens. But like I said, if they're not causing any problems, they're fun to have around. They can attract other birds and things like that as well, but they're one that a lot of people don't even know are around them. Then we have this fella. This is the beaver. This is my other rodent. This is our largest rodent in Indiana. You can tell these 2 apart based on size and based on the tail, right? Beaver, well-known, flat, scaly tail, right? I'm sure you can all imagine a beaver tail right now. Muskrats also have a scaly tail, but it's kind of more of a rat tail, but it's flattened on the sides rather than being flattened top to bottom. And also, muskrats are about the size of like a Nerf football, whereas beaver are like basketball or bigger. So if you're like, is that a basketball swimming through the water or a little Nerf football? That will tell you probably which one you're looking at. Even baby beaver are bigger than muskrats. Beaver are quite large animals. Beaver are actually one of the species, too, that continues to grow throughout its life. So there can be 100-pound beavers if it's a very old beaver. They can get very large. So size and trying to see the tail. When they're swimming, you can't always see the tail very well, but beaver carry their tail fully under the water when they're swimming, whereas muskrats carry their tail at the surface and it'll kind of be moving back and forth. So if you see something swimming and there's little splish splashes behind it, it's probably a muskrat, because beavers carry their tail fully under the water when they're swimming. Now, beaver, again, provide a lot of great habitat in places where they build their dams. They're ecosystem engineers, so kind of like humans, they'll change their landscape to suit their needs. And the ponds that they form can provide great habitat for some species. And their dams themselves can basically be highways for wildlife to cross bodies of water. But if they're in the wrong spot, they can also flood important infrastructure like roads and even people's houses and things like that, right? Beaver are very territorial, so we often get asked, can we move the beaver? And the answer is you can try, but they are like fight to the death territorial. They will not tolerate any other beaver around their home. And we have beaver pretty much statewide, right? So it's hard to find a place to take the beaver where there's not already beaver. So it can be kind of a challenge. But again, there's a lot of places beaver exist and they don't pose any problems, and then they can provide great habitat and beautiful wetlands and things like that. But if you are having a beaver flooding issue around your home or a road or things like that, they can also be removed, and the dam can be removed without a permit. You can't take out a lodge unless you have a permit. Lodges are where beavers actually live. Dams are just the structures that they build to block water because they hate the sound of running water. They've actually had beavers and there was no water, but they played the sound of running water and they covered it up to try to get it to stop. Like we don't know why, but they cannot stand the sound of running water and they want to make it stop. But they're a pretty common one. Again, it's not one you think of around Indianapolis, but there are some beaver in this area. We had reports of one, I forget what the park name now is, but kind of on the north side. There's a park up there, and someone was like, there's a beaver. Do we need to move it? I was like, no, it's got it. It knows it's going to figure it out. Don't worry. I can probably just take the creeks until it finds a good place to set up shop. It's probably a young one who's like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm just going to swim around for a while. So they can handle themselves. I'm sure you all can recognize this black and white charismatic animal. This is our striped skunk. Now, there are other species of skunks in the United States. There's actually 5 of them, but we only have the striped skunk. Obviously, distinctive black and white markings and the very distinctive odor I'm sure many of you have smelled. We're coming into breeding season, which is when a lot of them get hit on the road, and the smell becomes very pervasive, right? These guys are, again, omnivores. They'll eat some fruit, but they really like insects. They have long front claws, and they use them to dig for a lot of their food. So they eat things like earthworms and grubs and crickets and things like that. They like to dig up some of the invertebrates that live in our soils or break into like rotten logs to pull out ants and stuff like that. But they will also eat fruit and occasionally mice and stuff like that they can catch. Now, skunks, other than the smell, relatively, innocuous. We don't have a lot of problems with them. But we want to avoid situations like this. You're all like, are you promoting feeding skunks with your cat? No. Please don't do this. Skunks can carry some diseases. We did have our first case of rabies in the last 20 years in a skunk. It was down by Louisville, not up in this area, right? But there's always a risk, and so we do not recommend things like this. But skunks will very readily come into things like outdoor cat food, right? So if you have animals that you're feeding outside, best practices are to let them eat the food and then clean up anything they don't eat, or try to feed them somewhere that wildlife can't get to it. Can you feed them inside a garage or a covered porch or things like that? That way we avoid situations like this, where there's animals sharing bowls and things like that, because that's when we see disease transmission and stuff like that. Otherwise, skunks can be just like acute. You don't want to startle them. They have terrible eyesight. So you might be like, how does the skunk not see me? But it might not see you. So like noise is good if you happen across a skunk, right? Just be like, hey, fella, I'm right here, over here. That way it knows you're there. Because you could probably walk up to a skunk and it's going to get upset about it, and you probably won't like the outcome. But you'll be like, this skunk has to see me, right? It's going to leave. But it might not see you. They don't have good eyesight. Smell is what they rely on a lot, and hearing to a lesser degree for foraging and things like that. So they're kind of, they're nearsighted in the wildlife world. So do not assume a skunk can see you if you encounter one, but usually just talking softly to it, moving away, you're fine. Because they aren't runners. They obviously have a very special defense mechanism of making everything smell terrible. So that's what they use instead. Okay, now we're going to highlight just a couple more of our animals, but around, maybe less likely to see. This is the river otter. They're one of the species like the turkey and the deer and beaver and things like that in the early 1900s we lost. We reintroduced river otter in 1995. They're now in pretty much every county again. They've done really well since the reintroductions. There are otters in the White River. So you will see them here. There could be otters swimming by right now. That would be ironic, but it's a bit cold. They're probably snagged up somewhere. But they are common throughout the state. A lot of our waterways. Muscatatuck National Wildlife Refuge is a great place to go try to see otter. If you go this time of year, you just look for the holes in the ice, and they'll pop up out of them because they'll be swimming around underneath. They eat a lot of things like fish, mussels, frogs. They'll eat muskrats and things like that. And one of the things, if you're a paddler, that's usually your best chance to see them if you like to canoe or kayak. And we actually have a volunteer opportunity for anyone who does canoe or kayak called the Paddlecraft Wildlife Index. And that's where paddlers sign up in advance, and then in June and July they tell us where they paddled, how long they were paddling, and what wildlife they saw. And that's one of the long-term trend surveys we're trying to develop for things like river otter, muskrat, beaver, and our mink. So it can be a great opportunity. This is a fox in a kayak. This is a very a table-grabbing display that I like to take to events if I'm promoting paddlecraft, because it catches a lot of attention. But if you're a paddler, it's also a great way to see otters. being out on the river, especially dawn and dusk. They're what we call crepuscular. So they like mornings and evenings, kind of as the light is shifting. So that's a great time to see them. But you can see them any time of day. So I've run into some in the middle of the day. It depends on the otter. Otter are what I call tiny agents of chaos. People are like, yes, there was a mom otter and a dad otter. And I was like, not necessarily. Otters do whatever they feel like at the time. So there could be like 30 male otters hanging out together in a slough, and then there'll be just like 3 unrelated otters hanging out with a male and female pair, and they kind of just bounce and kind of do whatever they feel like. So they don't have the structure that some of my other animals do. Like beaver are like, I will fight you if you come over here. Otters are like, do you want to hang out for a week? And they're like, yes. And then they do. So don't assume anything if you see a group of otters. It could be any combination of otters. But they have that reputation for being very playful, and that comes from actually them being really good hunters. That's them keeping in shape to be able to catch things like fish and muskrats and stuff like that. Then we have the bobcat. I'm going to get this out of the way now. We don't have mountain lions in Indiana. We did confirm one in 2009 in Greene County, but we have not confirmed any since then. So if you see a medium-sized tan cat and you're sure it's not a house cat, it is probably a bobcat. These guys are around Indianapolis. We've gotten reports up here. They're not super common in this area yet. They're more common in southern Indiana and up the west side of the state, but they are around. Again, they like rabbits and mice and things like that. Kind of smaller prey generally. They're solitary. So the male will only hang out with the female during breeding season, and then he doesn't come around again. So sometimes if you see a group of bobcats, it's usually the mom and her kittens, but the kittens stick around for almost a full year. So you might see like 3 full-size bobcats, and that's probably a mom and 2 kittens from the year before. She hasn't kicked out quite yet. So basically, she gets them to move on right when she's about to have her next litter. And most of the litters are born in spring. The bobcats can technically breed any time of year, but most of them have them in spring, have their kittens in spring. And 1 to 3 kittens is typical for a bobcat. They aren't having some of the larger litters like our foxes and stuff do. They're a pretty neat animal. Again, an elusive one. Typically, you will not see one of these, right? They're hanging around your house at 3 a.m. when you're asleep, and they're looking for a rabbit. Here's an example video we were submitted. There we go. So you will notice a person came out of this house up here, and the bobcat's like, oh crap, and ran away. That's normal, right? That bobcat was probably like, there are any rabbits, stop paying attention around here. And then the person came out of the house, and the bobcat moved on its merry way. So the best way to tell a bobcat from a house cat, because we sometimes get house cats reported, well, honestly, we get a lot of house cats reported as mountain lions, but if we get them confused with bobcats, there are some short-tailed breeds of house cat, right? There's things like the Manx and the bobtail that have short tails. So we'll occasionally get a like, is this a bobcat? The best way is to look at the tail. Bobcat tails are not missing, because some of those bobtail breeds, there's like no tail. There is a tail, it's typically 4 to 6 inches, and it's black on top and white underneath. So if there's black and white on the tail, then you're probably looking at a bobcat. If it's solid color, the same color as the body, it's probably a short-tailed house cat. Does anybody know what this is? No? Good guess. Relate it to the fisher mink. This is our mink. This is another animal where they're around, but a lot of people do not know they exist, right? They're in the weasel family, so they're a cousin to the otter, but they often get confused for either otters or weasels. Nobody guesses mink, they guess otter or weasel typically. And the way to tell these guys apart is, like with the bobcat, look at the butt. With most of my animals, if you're trying to tell what animal it is, look at the butt. The tail will tell you probably most likely what it is. For mink, they have this bushy tail, whereas otters have a much smoother rope-like tail. And weasel tails are very thin, and they have a black tip on them. Mink will also typically have a little bit of white either on their chin or their chest, or they'll just be this solid chocolate brown. Whereas weasels, which I'm going to show you a picture of next, are kind of white or cream all along the chest and belly, and otters are just a little lighter on the chest or belly, but they don't have bits of white on them. So mink are often around if you have muskrats around, because they like to eat muskrats. They'll also eat mice, they'll eat frogs, they'll eat snakes, things like that. They hang around water, so another good one that you can see while you're paddling. But they will move over upland a lot more than river otters even will, because they'll go up into like forested areas and things like that to look for mice and stuff. So not one people think about a lot, but one that is statewide. Could be on any of our creeks, the White River, places like that. There's probably mink mopping around. But like I said, often gets mistaken for some of its other weasel relatives. So we have 2 weasels in Indiana. These are them. This is the least weasel, and this is the long-tailed weasel. Now from this picture, you're like, how do you tell those apart? Look at the butt. Long-tailed, I couldn't get a good picture of a least weasel with its tail, but basically, least weasels are tiny. They're the smallest member of the order Carnivora in the world. They're only about that big, and their tail is short, and it's all brown. Long-tailed weasels, as their name implies, and you can kind of see through the grass here, their tails are typically like 4 to 6 inches, and it's tipped in black. So if it's got a longer tail, black tip, that's a long-tailed weasel. If it's short tail and very small bodied, that's a least weasel. These we think are statewide. We don't know a ton about them. They probably are around, but people don't see them very often. Usually if we get a report of a weasel, it's because someone's cat has killed one and brought it to them. So we don't know a ton about these. They're doing a little bit of survey work now for some small mammal community stuff that we're hoping will pick up some weasels and help us better understand their distribution. But as far as we know, both of these are statewide. The long-tailed weasel seems to be a little more common than the least weasel. So, but usually the number one place you'll run into a weasel and it not be your cat bringing you a present is around wood piles, which, I mean, how many people have wood piles now? The number's dwindling. Some people still do, but you know, if you're living in the suburbs, you probably don't have a big wood pile behind your house. So, not one a lot of people get to see, but pretty cool animals, eat mice and things like that. And then this is our other fox that I was going to tell you about. This is our gray fox. Right? This is actually our native fox. Red foxes were native to the boreal forest in the United States, we think, but most of the continental United States' red foxes were brought over by Europeans. But we consider them naturalized. You know, they're a part of our Indiana community, have been for a long time for red foxes, but gray foxes are native and have been here for probably thousands of years. Right? Again, how do you tell a gray from a red? Look at the butt. Red foxes have a white tip on their tail. Gray foxes have a black stripe down the top of their tail. It also can help because red foxes have black legs and ears. Gray foxes have brown legs and ears. So if you see any black on the leg or the ear, red fox. Because there are a few color phases of red foxes where they can look gray and it can be confusing. But mostly around here, you're going to see the red fox. Our gray foxes are stronghold to southern Indiana, kind of Perry, Crawford, Harrison counties along the river. So that's kind of their core area. We just wrapped up some cool research on them, but they're not common in this area, so that's a whole other presentation if you want me to come back at some point and delve into gray foxes and what we've learned about them. They're really cool because they can climb trees. They're one of the only canids in the world that's capable of climbing trees. They have specially adapted claws, and a lot of people don't think to like look up in a tree to see if there's a fox up there. But with gray foxes, it might be up in a tree. They like forested grassland edges, so that's why typically southern part of the state is where we have more of them. There are a few pockets in the northeast and the northwest part of the state. But they're not really common in the central part of the state here. And finally, we're going to end on the badger. We are at the edge of badger range, so we do not have a lot of badgers. They're not super common. They like sandy, loamy soils. So where we do get our most badger reports are kind of north of here, up when you get to Grant County and north of there, and over in the Kankakee Sands part of the state, right? So there could be a badger in this area, but they're pretty hard to see. I worked on a badger research project for 4 months, and I saw one badger, even though I was literally following badgers around. They're not easy to see, right? And they do get confused with groundhogs sometimes, but the black and white face marks here can really help with a badger, because a lot of times they'll be hanging out in a den and you won't be able to see the butt. So for them, black and white on the face versus brown face for a groundhog. So they do get confused sometimes. Groundhogs are very common throughout the state. Badgers are less common. And we don't know a ton about them either. We're hoping we can do some more work with badgers, but as far as we know, they're not common, but they're stable, to the best of our knowledge. So, but like I said, more sandy soils mixed with loam that they can dig into easily. They dig for their food, so they eat things like moles and ground squirrels and things like that live underground, and they have big claws, and they can dig them up and eat them that way. So they're a pretty cool animal, pretty cool part of Indiana's community, but not one you're likely to run into unless you got a trail camera in just the right spot, most likely. So, and with that, I can take any questions. I did bring some furs, so once we're done, if you want to come up, see the furs of these different animals that I've been talking about. And like I said, I have the Living with Wildlife fact sheets for coyotes and raccoons with me because those are our two most common, and two we get a lot of questions about. So what questions do you have for me?
I have a question about
Yeah.
animals you didn't talk about. Why aren't like groundhogs and squirrels and deer lumped into the furbearers?
Yeah, so it has to do with their fur and their historical like use of it, right? Because a lot of people assume like rabbits are a fur bearer, but they're not. There are like, you can sometimes get rabbit trim on like gloves and stuff like that. But historically, rabbits were more hunted than they were trapped. And they don't have the nice double layer of fur most of the fur bearers have. So they were more part of a small game category rather than the fur bearer category. The same's true with squirrels. Like, no one's making a coat out of squirrels, but they do use squirrel tails for things like flies, for fishing and things like that. But traditionally hunted, and their fur use is kind of more limited, but you will still, if you go to a fur sale, see some squirrel tails show up there. Same thing with deer. The main market for deer is actually the leather, not the fur, right? So they're typically in a different category. It's all about the fur, and why these guys are lumped together. And some of those other ones you might think aren't part of that. So, and groundhogs, not a soft fur. I don't know how many of you are going around petting groundhogs. Please don't, but like they're not a soft fur compared to these species up here. So, somebody over, yeah.
So you mentioned the animals that went extinct and were reintroduced. Did beavers go extinct, and when were they reintroduced?
Yeah, we lost beavers, we think, almost completely. They were reintroduced in the 1930s, though. They were a very early reintroduction. We got a few from Wisconsin, and I think maybe a couple from Michigan at some point. But yeah, I think Jasper Pulaski is actually where we put beaver back for the first time, but it was a very long time ago in the 1930s. So, and then we also reintroduced river otter from the furbearer side. We didn't introduce bobcats, though, or coyotes. People accuse us of that all the time. Both of those, coyotes have always been here. Bobcats naturally expanded back on their own.
So for other species that have gone extinct that haven't been reintroduced, like bears, blackbeards, and that sort of thing, is there any conversation of reintroducing them, or is it one of those, like, trying to find the balance between humans and people, and
Yeah.
most people would freak out if they saw a black bear in their backyard?
Yeah, so there's a balance there. It's also reintroductions of big animals like that are a lot more logistically difficult, right? Some species, it's better to let them expand back on their own rather than making the effort to reintroduce them. Black bears are probably in that category because there's a mix of people really like them, but they also can cause a lot of problems. And they're moving up the scale of like, the problems they cause can be dangerous. Right, compared to some others. And bears are expanding. Black bears, they're doing really well. We will probably have black bears at some point in the next, 50 years. We get an occasional male that moves through right now, but it's a young male who's just on like a walkabout, basically. And then when they can't find any females, they leave again. So I think we've confirmed like 5 black bears in the last 10 years or so that come through. We have habitat for black bears. And populations in Ohio and Kentucky are increasing, so they might come back on their own eventually, but reintroductions are also very expensive. It's a lot of money to reintroduce a species. They had to do a ton of fundraising to reintroduce the otter and things like that. So it's logistically like a big lift, and it's even a bigger lift when you're talking about a larger animal and things like that. So.
With the pandemic, did you guys have any data or information about changes in populations or animal behavior?
We don't have a ton of good data that would get into some of those nuances. We have maybe a little bit of camera data. We're actually trying to look, some researchers figured out that you can estimate density with cameras by distance sampling is what we call it. You kind of know how far away the animal is from the camera, and you can run a complicated equation to figure out, it's like, we probably have 10 turkeys per square mile in this area. And we're kind of working through some of that data, and that was for 1920 and 21, so that kind of overlaps that time period a little bit. And we might be able to see, but I don't know how much densities would have changed during that time, and we don't have a lot of good, that would get at, did any behavior change during that time from the data that we collect.
You would have, if hunters are out collecting, but then people maybe weren't going out, you might not have as much data?
Actually, there were more hunters out because there was nothing else to do. We actually saw a spike in sales for fishing, hunting, all of it. There was a bump in 2020 because they're like, we are bored and there's nothing else, where there are no theaters open, we cannot do anything else. Let's maybe go try turkey hunting. I don't know. So we actually saw bumps in license sales during that time. So there were probably actually more people on the landscape for that short amount of time. But again, in certain areas, that wasn't in our urban areas and things like that necessarily. So we don't have a lot of good data, like good ways we could have looked at, did any of their like behavior or ranges shift kind of during that time period, so.
On the subject of diseases, are any of the fur-bearing animals more susceptible to like the bird flu variations that are going around right now?
Yeah, we know red foxes can get AI. We haven't found any dead red foxes that tested positive for AI, but it has happened in some other states. We think it comes from, because they've had a few cases in like Canada and stuff like that, red foxes. It has to do with the mom like feeding pups dead birds kind of thing. And there's starting to be some information about cats, some house cat susceptibility. So we don't know if it transfers into bobcats, but it's an area we're interested in. We haven't picked up on any like die-offs, like a lot of something for my species, not even turkeys. Turkeys don't seem to be largely impacted by AI, that we've been able to attribute to AI. But obviously with that being a big issue, an emerging issue and stuff like that right now, we are keeping an eye out for stuff like that. And we do try to test things if we have questions about, could this be this thing? So we always get a few bobcats every year that are like roadkill and stuff like that, and we're probably gonna be swabbing a few of them this year just to see if any of them come back positive and stuff like that. But
How much direct interaction do you get with these animals on like a day-to-day?
me, none. Yeah, so I'm the program leader, which means I do all the paperwork, and I pay other people to go actually collect data. Yeah, at this point. So mostly my interactions with some of these animals are after they have died, collecting samples off of them. That's my main interaction. I am not doing a lot of active, like, let's go catch the raccoon and put a transmitter on it kind of stuff. We have researchers that we pay to do things like that. Because like I said, we wrapped up a big Prairie fox study and they were putting collars out, but to maximize the things I'm capable of trying to get done in a year, I am spinning all the plates and other people are helping do those sorts of things, so. Yeah.
Where'd you get your furs from? Hunters?
It depends. Some of them are hunted or trapped. Some might be roadkill. It's kind of a mixed bag. Usually licensed trappers is the main way furs are like available in the market for buying for education.
But you specifically, you know, like, I know I can go out and buy a fur from a trapper.
Yeah.
But you, the state of Indiana, do you collect them yourself? Do you buy them from others?
No, we typically are buying them. Yeah. Occasionally, we'll have some that were like, there was a couple years where we would have otters that were caught in like beaver traps, but the trapper was maybe at their bag limit already and things like that, because we do have a regulated limited season on river otter. And there was the Indiana State Trappers Association actually helped us skin a few of those and put them up so we could get a tan for education. So we know those actually came from Indiana trappers, but for the most part, like this coyote pelt, the raccoon pelt, I bought them. So they probably were from licensed trappers, but I do not know for sure. Yep.
How territorial do foxes get about their, like when they have their kids? Do you ever get reports of foxes attacking pets or animals, or do they generally like stay to themselves?
Yeah, they typically seem to be able to keep to themselves. Surprisingly, for how much foxes den like up under barns and decks and stuff like that, and a lot of people have dogs, we don't get a lot of reports of red fox dog interactions. So I think mostly, probably the landowners are doing some diligence to keep their dogs away from the foxes if they know there's a den there. But I think foxes, they don't want other foxes around. They try to keep out, canines to some degree. But I think they've kind of learned that those yards are kind of a safe space in a way for them to try to raise pups. And I'm guessing if there was like a big aggressive dog, they wouldn't den there. But we get very few calls about that actually as a problem, so.
Well, round of applause. I'm going to stand awkwardly on this side now.
Yeah.
So just before we break camp here, and you can go check out all the lovely furs and such, thanks for coming out. We want to invite you to next month, March 25th at 7 p.m., same place. Brian Glover is going to be here talking about the history of the Roberts Settlement, which was a free black community in northern Hamilton County, founded in the 1830s. He is a descendant, so he is going to be telling us the history about that. So we're looking forward to that. So thanks again for coming, and thanks, Jan, for coming.
Yeah, no problem.